Okay, hi everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're still missing a few more people, but I'm sure they will trickle in. We have a lot to talk about today and a guest presenter we're very excited to have. So I'm going to go ahead and just introduce our speaker. We have Robb Davis here right now. Robb's giving a wave here. He is currently an international student advisor at UC Davis and the mayor of Davis, California. Previously, don't be intimidated. Previously, he worked for over 25 years in the international public health programming in over 30 nations around the world, and on local programs dealing with homelessness and addiction, as well as restorative justice. Robb has designed health and conflict resolution learning events and courses for a variety of groups in over 30 countries. He's designed training and master level courses on project planning, monitoring, and evaluation. His focus has been on training in-depth interviewing techniques and participatory learning. He holds a Ph.D. in population dynamics and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. So we're excited to have Robb here today. We are recording this session, so for future reference, and we have all of Robb's slides as well. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let Robb take it away. Just a reminder for everyone who's not speaking, if you could please mute yourself to reduce background noise, that would be great. Thank you.
How can I make sure people can hear me?
Can you give Robb, yeah, you're going to need some thumbs up.
Okay, I put away this. I'm not seeing the folks right now, so, but you guys that are not, you can hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. See that? Okay, cool. All right, well, let's get started. So what we're going to try to do today is, this is, sort of the theme, using participatory learning tools to learn with and from community members. And, there's a lot of rich history in the whole issue of participatory learning for action. It used to be called rapid rural appraisal. I'm not going to delve into that. I can certainly provide, plenty of readings to lay the foundation of it. But suffice to say that these tools evolved largely in sort of agro-ecosystem analysis back in the 70s when, sort of received wisdom about how farmers around the world maximize revenue or maximize profits didn't seem to be happening. And so initial response was, these people are not acting rationally. And others said, no, wait a second, we don't necessarily know why they're acting the way they are acting. And so we need tools and approaches to go and learn with people, together with them, to understand not just vague concepts of worldview, but what are their practices? Why do they practice what they're practicing? How can we work, especially in situations where we may have lower levels of literacy or people who are not, used to, sort of classroom learning? How can we engage in mutual learning together? It was infused, I think, later on by input from Paulo Freire, who taught literacy around, in Brazil and around the world, and wrote a key book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which he talked about the conflict of, the sort of the tension of the teacher and the learner. Who's the teacher? Who's the learner? And so many people in the development field, obviously viewed themselves somehow as having information they wanted to communicate. And Freire's point was, we have to deal with the tension that if you go merely as a teacher, then you're missing an opportunity to learn the richness that already exists in communities. So the tools evolved over time, but actually we're going to spend today relatively little time actually looking at the tools, because I want to step back and say underlying any participatory learning tool is really, it's really about learning how to interview people. And so interviewing techniques, I have found in my experience, there are very few graduate programs in development that do a good job teaching people about qualitative learning methods. Most programs are heavily quantitative. They may teach very good structured learning, using standardized questionnaires. Fewer, and actually very few, in my experience, teach people how to rigorously do in-depth, semi-structured interviewing. And we're going to describe what that means. So the first part of what we're going to do today is to really examine what good interviewing is, what good qualitative interviewing is. We're not going to do quantitative today. And then I'll try to what I'm going to put forward in the slides is just some things to think about as you're practicing interviewing. And then I'd like to do a little bit of practice maybe with Lauren here so you can critique it. And then I'll introduce some of the participatory learning tools. So we'll see how far we get. And again, I don't know why. Stop. So I just start off with this: participation is a commitment, not a tool. Now, I just talked about participatory learning tools, but fundamentally, we're either going into a situation believing that people in that situation have rich knowledge that we should tap into as we're working to try to improve or change or help them consider a new practice. So I just talked to a few of you here. There's going to be, some of you are going to be working on pest management issues, others on post-harvest conservation issues, all of those, and I'm sure there are others that I don't know, but all of those imply the idea that you're coming with something to share. And I think that's fine. The question is, are you coming into that situation also to learn? Not assuming that, you're coming with the knowledge and people are like a blank slate, but that they may have practices that actually enhance what you're doing or practices that in some cases may even be superior. So participation is a commitment. Yes, there are tools that enable us to engage communities and sort of unlock the door to learning from them, but really we have to start with a commitment that we don't possess all wisdom and knowledge, and there's practice and experience that we need to tap into locally. So I think that's where I want to start. Then I would just invite you, as you're thinking about the location you're going to, even the organizations you're going to be working with, what is your approach to learning from them? Like, how do you want to not just participate with community members, but what about the local organizations you'll be going with? What's your commitment to tapping into their knowledge as well? And one of the things I would hope that you would reflect on and maybe do some writing on is what is participation imply as you go into your situation. So this is a really busy chart. We're not going to walk through it, but the reason I put it up is because the way I've evolved my practice on these issues is it's not as pure research. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about and sharing in terms of interviewing techniques comes out of ethnographic studies, applied anthropology. I'm not trying to teach you to do ethnographies as sort of a way to approach a community to learn about their cultural practices or whatever. I ground this in my own practice in program and projects. So I put this chart up to say, all project planning has a sort of, and this is way too linear, I get that, but has a sort of a set of phases, right? There's some initial diagnosis going on of, what's happening in this community. I mean, if you're going to do something, I'm going to keep using you guys as examples. If you're going to do something on pest management or on post-harvest conservation, that means there's some need that's been identified there, right? I mean, you're going in already. So, but there's always a possibility when we're entering a situation or even re-entering or renewing again or reviewing again to do this sort of preparatory analysis, right? Then based on that, we will do some sort of detailed implementation planning. And I'm assuming as part of the training that you're going through, you're learning things, like, SWOT analysis, log frame planning, problem trees, etc. That's the guts of detailed implementation planning. But then, of course, you have an implementation phase in which there's ongoing structured learning about how the implementation is going. So you're never, this whole chart is to say all throughout the project cycle, from preparation to final evaluation, you have a need to learn. You have a need to learn about your own practice. How's it going? What do we need to improve? You have a need to learn about whether you're having impacts, whether you're achieving the outcomes that you want and the impacts that you want. And those boxes there are merely there, those red boxes are merely there to say that all throughout a project cycle, that learning uses certain typical tools, right? You can use small surveys, using small sample sizes. That's the quantitative stuff. I've done a lot of work in that field using lot quality assurance sampling, which I'd be happy to talk about some other time. But you're also using, in an ongoing way, in-depth interviewing. That is where you're trying to take something that you see. So maybe you see evidence of an improved practice, or maybe you don't. And you might want to ask the question, what's going on? How are people receiving this information? How are they processing it? What do they think about it? Are they adopting? If they're not adopting, why aren't they adopting? If they are adopting, what changes is it making? And the point is, in this red box is, all of these things here are the resources that you need. So you need to know how to, in my opinion, and I don't mean to be so forceful, but in my opinion, my own practice has been enriched by semi-structured interview approaches, group facilitation, and that's where participatory learning comes in. How do we learn from groups of participants? Not just individual interviews, but how do we approach groups to learn? Then, of course, there are sample survey methodologies and observation tools. So part of each part of a project or a program, there is a need to learn. There's a need to learn up front so you can gauge exactly the type of intervention you want to do. During the implementation phase, there's ongoing process monitoring, or progress tracking is what I prefer to call it. And some point you want to do a more structured final evaluation, or a midterm evaluation to sort of step back. In all of those phases, you can use similar tools, structured observation, key informant interviews, group-based learning, and in all of those, participatory tools can be used. And if you use participatory tools, interviewing is the foundation of that. Interviewing people to get rich textual information is the foundation. So that's why I put this up. By the way, I don't know how to have people stop me if they have questions. Can you monitor? Is there a hand raising function?
That's a good question. Let's see.
Because I want you to interrupt could you monitor
There's
that?
A chat box if people have questions and want to type them into the chat function. I can keep an eye on that.
Keep an eye on it.
We can unmute people and they can elaborate.
Yeah, that'd be great. If you can so if you're having questions, just type a quick, even just like a question mark, and we'll take them. Because I don't know, it's hard for me to discern what's relevant and what's not if I don't hear a few questions. So let me just take one more step to sort of lay the groundwork here. What I'm really articulating from the beginning is that we have two broad ways of garnering information: qualitative tools and quantitative tools. And again, I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but I think our natural bent, most of us in social sciences, or certainly in the hard sciences, come immediately to that quantitative data, proportion of people that adopt a process or an action. In my field, number of changes in the cases of measles, or reduction in malaria transmission, and these are all based around proportions. We use numbers to summarize fairly complex information in a digestible way. We like that because we kind of believe that numbers are truth. And so, if we can put a number on it, X% of people are practicing, that feels really real to us. And that's helpful. I mean, I think, numbers are important, and being able to express our confidence in those numbers using confidence intervals and all that is valuable, and we need it. And it paints an important picture of change. But I would also argue that the qualitative tools help us get below the surface to understand some of the dynamics of that change. So what's driving that change? What are barriers to change? When I see a percent change, or more frequently, when I don't see a percent change in the field, one of the things that we used to look at was vaccination coverage. So we would go out and we would actually review vaccination cards, and we would explore, percent changes. Well, we soon came to realize that in a number of communities, vaccination rates, this was back many years ago, were not going up. Well, you can't, from a simple survey, can't ask a question, why aren't you vaccinating? Right? It just doesn't, choose one of the following answers. I don't like vaccines, I'm an anti-vaxxer, whatever. We realized that we needed to use other tools to get at some of what was going on in the dynamic. And pretty much, and I could multiply the examples in the health field but in any field, if we're talking about farming practices, again, getting farmers to articulate how they view a particular intervention, how they understand it, and how they view it working for them or not is important. And that cannot be garnered through structured interviewing. It requires richer description and context that needs to be laid out. Yeah.
We had one question come in from Nataraja. He said, I've previously experienced that farmers are reluctant to give information related to crop yields, net profits, market prices, etc. In that case, how do we get clear information through surveys? Do we have any other tools to get such information? And
right.
We actually have a follow-up question. Is it possible to use qualitative and quantitative approaches at the same time?
Yes, right. So there's any number of issues that people don't want to talk about because it reveals a secret. So, and I really do think that qualitative tools, while they can't, again, they may not yield a succinct parameter estimate, they can be used to understand what's working for farmers. Let me just give an example. A very useful tool. So you might say to farmers, all right, well, let's talk, let me interview farmers and find out what their earnings were last year. And I'll plot that on a graph, and I can graph the mean, the median, and outliers. And that information may be very hard to come by. But what you may be able to do with a group of farmers in a more general sense is to say, all right, here's a pile of stones that I'm going to put before you. You all live in this community. I'd like you to divide it into groups. Farmers who are extremely successful, farmers that are doing okay, and farmers that are struggling. Just start with those groups. Or start with meaningful groups. You divide that up into how successful farmers are. And they may come up with 4 groups, or they may come up with 5, or they may come up with 2. And then you can explore, right, what does success mean? And in doing that, you're not getting at revenue numbers, right, still, but you are getting at what makes for success and how that's articulated in that community. And it may be things like, well, they have land holding, or they actually earn revenue on a cash crop, or, these other farmers over here are purely subsistence. It's not a replacement for a parameter estimate, but at times it may be the best you can do given the sensitivity of the information. And that may just be a starting point, right? It may be a starting point where you say, all right, this community gave me 5 categories. Now I can go talk to farmers and sort of say, where would you put yourself on this continuum? And it gives you a relative sense of things. The point is, and to the second question, so I don't know if that helps, but to the second question, I really believe these tools should be used in conjunction with each other. So the qualitative can help you understand how to frame a question even. And the qualitative can also help you post-quantitative survey to go in and ask people questions about the results. So we got this, well, here's an example, a classic example from my field. It goes way back. That, a survey of women in Nepal showing that knowledge of abortion practices was essentially 0. That's what the quantitative survey showed. Well, they went back in using qualitative with one-on-one interviews, in-depth interviews with women, and found out that every woman knew not just one, but several ways to induce an abortion. They couldn't get at it through the quantitative. They had a quantitative result, but they needed a qualitative one-on-one in-depth interview to go deeper and kind of give people in a protected environment the ability to talk about that. So I think that qualitative can help because if you look at the overall purpose, rich, complete, detailed description of context, and if you have that, it can also help you formulate your questions for a quantitative survey. Does that make sense? I'm just looking, yeah, okay. So in the qualitative field, again, the result is words, pictures, diagrams. I use taxonomies. Taxonomies are just how people organize life, the categories of life, if you will. They may use objects. But the tools that we use for that are unstructured, semi-structured, or what I call standardized interviews. We also use observation, participant observation, and if documentation exists, we may review it. Those are all qualitative tools. They're largely built around text and getting people to talk. So I'm going to keep going, and if people have other questions, if they feel I'm not answering a question clearly enough, they can come back. So, this is going to be, I'm always afraid to share this because I think it's going to be so simplistic that you'll be like, duh, everybody knows that. But really, these are the key principles to semi-structured and standardized interviewing. And I should say, I think I'll get into it, but just in case I don't, semi-structured interviewing and standardized interviewing are very similar in that they don't have a set of questions that must be asked. So in a structured survey, you want to make sure you ask every question in the exact same way to every respondent. Otherwise, you can't really estimate parameters because you introduce bias. That's in structured interview. In semi-structured and standardized, we have a category of things we want to learn about, themes. And I'll give an example of that in a little bit. We have some themes that we want to learn about. And we may even have some questions we want to ask, but we're also letting the interview guide follow-on questions. So rather than wanting to ask every one of you the exact same question, I allow the responses that each person gives to help me follow maybe an interesting thing that I'm hearing to go more in depth. So I have themes, I have some learning objectives, but in a semi-structured, I do allow the interview to guide it. I pull the interview back to my areas of interest, but I also allow the interview to guide where I go. Standardized interviewing is, I use it when I want a sort of a semi-structured approach, but with people who are less experienced in interviewing. So if I'm training a group of field workers who have not had long experience doing in-depth semi-structured interviews, I will actually write out questions I want them to ask, but with the idea that that question is not where you stop, that's just where you begin. And in semi-structured, if you're more experienced as an interviewer, you can just really have a series of 2 to 3 themes, and you learn to follow the lead of the person you're interviewing to go more in depth. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's what I mean by semi-structured versus standardized. So number 1, we use open-ended questions. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. We try to avoid leading questions. So we're not going in to prove something we already know. And so we're careful about using leading questions, and we'll talk about that. We probe. This is a critical one. We don't just end with an answer. I ask you, how it is to be a student here at this university, and you give me an answer, and I say, thank you very much. No, I take what you have said, and I probe it, right? Just like a probe. I push on it. I go deeper. I try to get you to give me more. Semi-structured interviewing is about letting the informant lead. They should do most of the talking. We prepare interview guides. Again, a guide is not a structured questionnaire. A guide is what it sounds like, a guide. It helps me remember the things I wanted to talk about. And these can be fairly complex. I mean, over a series of several interviews, you may want to go into depth on a number of issues. And what you're using your guide as is more or less to say, have we talked about this? So for example, if I want to talk about challenges students are facing at UC Davis, as an example, because I want to do an evaluation of the graduate program. But I also want to talk particularly about financial issues that students face. Or I particularly want to talk about housing challenges that they face. I may start off the interview in a general way talking about challenges. And if the respondent starts talking about financial challenges, I don't need to go back to that. But it's in my guide to make sure it gets covered at some point. So that's what I mean by a guide. Semi-structured interviewing actually requires us to think about how we ask questions. And it really takes practice. Not all questions are created equal. And there's no hard and fast rule of this, but you'll sort of know when you've hit it when you sort of see a key unlocking a door and people just bringing you information that was hard to get before. There are questions that seem to give people permission to really share. And you'll learn them as you do interviews. You'll see that there are things that will just kind of open the floodgate. And then we're not going to talk about this a lot today, and I probably should, but I just don't have time in a class like this. I have a whole course I teach on collecting, expanding, and coding notes. And times have changed a lot. When I was working in West Africa, I never used a tape recorder. And a lot of it was because I was dealing with sensitive issues that if I turned on a tape recorder, people wouldn't speak. That's still a lot of times the case. And so the critical thing is to learn how to take brief notes while you're interviewing, expand on them immediately after you're done interviewing, and then use any sort of software program or even hand coding to search for themes. And that's about all I'm going to say about that today because we just don't have time. But I'd be happy to work with anybody and get a little bit more in depth on note taking because it also is a real art and it's really challenging to do well. But I'll just say key is when you're interviewing someone, take down brief things, just a few key quotes, and then absolutely when that interview ends, I mean, not an hour later, you say, thank you for the interview. You immediately sit and you go through those notes and you expand them. And if you do that, you will recall significant portions of the interview. If you wait an hour, you'll recall a lot less. If you wait a day, you'll be like, I think I pretty much got it all. And you won't have gotten it all. So that's what I mean by expanding notes immediately. And then the coding of it is just a matter of looking for patterns in the terms that are used and concepts. Yeah.
So would you recommend trying the tape recorder first, or don't even go there, or try to gauge the situation before you bring it up?
This is where I think your partners can really help you, your partner organizations.
Even interviewing them, for example, I think that'll be everyone's first interview, not just with their partner.
I would ask, my default, and people really disagree on this, and I'm not an anthropologist, right? But I've never felt comfortable using them. And I've always felt like it created, I mean, look, I get interviewed a lot in my work, and I speak differently off the record. I do. When that tape is running, I in the back of my mind, I'm like, there are some things that I want to make sure I don't say. And so people will say, no, go ahead and use it. I think it's always sitting there as a potential obstacle. But it's hard. Let me just say, too, tape recorders are not panaceas. I mean, have you ever transcribed a half-an-hour interview?
It takes a long time.
It takes hours. I mean, people pay people to transcribe because it's a lot of work. And I think expanding notes immediately helps you achieve a lot of the goals. There's always some bias that can be introduced. I get that. The point is, at the end of this, you're collecting all these notes, not just to have stories to tell, but because you're looking over the series of interviews, and typically it's a series, right? Maybe different individuals, different perspectives, men, women, older, younger. We're looking for themes. We're looking for outliers. We're looking for people that say things that no one else has said. We're looking for themes that come up again and again. And we're looking for key terms, key words that people use to describe their lives. So let's look at these, just in turn. And normally it's a little bit more participatory. So closed questions. And again, closed questions are not just yes and no questions, but questions, and this is really important, questions for which the answer choices are either given to the respondent or understood by the respondent. So if you say something like, what are the 3 ways to prevent a cold? Well, that implies a limited number of correct answers. If you say, what are the 3 ways? It's rare that someone's going to say, no, actually there are 4. Or there are more than that. So you may think you know, but that sounds like a test question to me, right? So that's considered a closed question. Do you talk to people about your experiences as a student at UCD or Florida or NC State or wherever you are? That's an implied yes, no. And in some cases, when you ask yes, no questions, that's literally all you'll get, especially if the person doesn't know you. If you start asking a lot of yes, no questions, you're going to get yes, no. And that's probably not helpful in terms of this rich information. Here's a question that doesn't seem like a closed question, but it really is. Do people here want more or less government intervention? Right? Because I'm suggesting to you that one of those is your option, and there's no nuance there. So closed questions limit the breadth of information that a respondent has to offer. Now, some people who you interview will overcome your poorly worded closed questions and give you a lot more because they like to talk. But a lot of people will stop there, assuming that you know and that they need to answer you based on what you know. So open questions, on the other hand, are questions that allow the respondent to answer without presented or implied choices. And they don't have to even be questions. They can be things like, say more about your experiences dealing with rodents on your farm? That's not a question, right? Say more is not a question, but it's an invitation. So we should view open questions not just as questions where you put a question mark at the end, but also invitations to speak. So I said turn the above closed questions into open. And again, open questions, I know this is simple. What, where, who, when, how. Why, I put an asterisk next to. In our work, especially when we're evaluating our efforts, we really like why questions. We want to get to the why really quickly. And I'm just encouraging you to use the limit of why. And part of the reason is there's not always a reason, an easy reason for people's behavior. You know, if I ask you why you came to this university, you probably have an official answer that you've evolved to tell your family and friends. But there are probably a lot of other reasons. So I'm not saying don't ever use why, but you may learn a lot more about the why by asking where or who or when than you will by simply asking why. Because I don't know about you, but on a lot of issues, I have a narrative. I have a narrative. And if people ask me that, I'll give the official narrative. Rob, why aren't you running for office again in the city of Davis? I have an official answer, but it is not really why. I'm not lying, but it's my official answer. But there's a lot of complexity there. And 90% of the people don't want the complexity, they want the official. But if you want the complexity, don't just ask why. That's my point. So I don't know. You can go through these on your own. You know, what are 3 ways to prevent a cold? If we were in a more participatory learning environment, I'd ask you, but you can certainly imagine. Talk to me about ways people prevent colds around here. Talk to me about the most effective ways that you think people can prevent colds. Do you talk to people about your experience as a student at UC Davis? What are some of your experiences as a student? Who do you talk to about that? Who are some of the folks that you talk to about that, if you do? Do people here want more or less government intervention? What are some attitudes here about the role of local government? What are some attitudes here about the role of the federal government? How do you feel about the government's role in providing for rural populations? It could be so many things. Point is, you're inviting people as opposed to just giving them a more or less. Okay, leading questions. I'm just going to keep running on. Avoiding leading questions is really about allowing people to answer in their own terms, voicing their own views, values. So they're phrased, and these are really insidious, right? Because you don't even oftentimes catch yourself asking them. So if I ask, what do you like about the distance learning portion of this program? Well, that's leading because that's implying that you like at least something. It may be that you really detest the distance learning portion of a program. And so that is a leading. Why is the election process such a problem here? Well, the person I'm speaking to may not think that. I may be projecting onto the situation. How good, this is a bad question, but how good has your experience at this university been? I mean, but there are many ways that we do leading, that we introduce leading questions. As simple as saying, what parts of this program are good? It's probably better to start more generally. Talk to me about what this program means to you. Is probably better than suggesting there's something good about it. Again, you could turn these into non-leading questions. I put this out there just for you to think about. And as you're starting your practice in interviewing, you may want to have people observe you. That's one of the reasons I sent around the checklist. It summarizes a lot of the things that we're talking about and can help you in your own practice. So this is where I want to spend a little bit more time probing, because I think there's no other thing that I've learned through the years of interviewing that's as useful as thinking through how to probe. So probing, and this is a quote from Bernard, who wrote a research methodology book a long time ago. A key to successful interviewing is learning how to probe effectively. That is to stimulate an informant to produce more information without injecting yourself so much into the interaction that you only get a reflection of yourself in the data. And probing is fun, and it's really, it's almost, you learn to do it, and there are many ways to do it. So here are just a few types of probes that I think are useful to keep in mind. And again, probes are about getting people to talk more. So echo. Repeat the last thing the respondent said with a slight rise in the voice. So the person says, I think, whatever X is, I think that the support of the ag extension worker here is really helpful. You think it's helpful? They're never going to just say, yeah, it's helpful. that rise in your voice and using their words, I think it's helpful. You think it's helpful, is an invitation, right? It's an invitation. That's a probe. Re-question. This is a simple one. So you've talked about the extension worker for a while. What else would you like to say about your experiences? Or what else would you like to say about that interaction? And it's rare that people will say, I don't really have anything else to say about it. They will, but just re-questioning. What else? Obviously silence. And this is one that I find particularly difficult. But silence is really important because a lot of times when you ask a question, you've thought about that question for a while. Sometimes, not infrequently, when you ask a question of someone, they haven't been thinking about it. And so while you're asking the question, they're starting to say, wow, what does she want from me? What is she looking for? That's one thing that happens. But the other is, what should I say? And if someone starts to answer, and then you say, okay, thanks, let's go on to the next question, you may be cutting off their ability to really go deeper into what they really think. So silence is a way of giving people permission to keep talking. And what happens frequently, in my experience, is, when someone gives us an answer, we're so excited with the answer, especially if it confirms something that we already believe, that we'll be like, okay, well, good, thanks. I got another question for you. Whereas they may have a more nuanced addition that they want to give. And silence is that permission. And silence means silence. Silence can mean, till it feels a little uncomfortable. Recap. Recap is really effective. So someone will go on and talk about, I'm just going to keep using the concept of extension worker, and go on and talk about an extension worker. And then a recap is simply say, you said something really important there. Could you just repeat that? Could you just repeat what you said about that extension worker and what they meant to you? People never repeat what they just said. Never. People are not running a tape recorder in their mind or, and then they rewind it and spit it back out again. They're always going to add something or change something, interpret what they said. They'll give you more. And then the last two are encouragement. And these need to be done with a little bit of care. Verbal probes such as, yeah, thank you. Or nonverbal such as, shaking your head. In some places where I've worked, people click in their throat or shake their head up and down, side to side. Those can be good, both the verbal and the nonverbal. But we want to be cautious not to be too effusive. Oh, that's awesome. Oh, that's excellent. And then the person's going to say, oh, I said something that person liked. Well, maybe I'll just keep going in that. Or, or like giving a sense of disappointment. I mean, it's funny. And this is where across cultures, it can be really challenging to interview. And again, I struggled with this when I first went to India, and people would go side to side with yes, and I was used to up and down. I was always troubled with what I was actually seeing. But the point is, don't be too effusive in any of these things. Don't be biasing their response by saying, that's it. Thank you so much. That was the answer I was looking for. Because then they're just going to wait for you to do that again, thinking that you really do want them to say certain things. These probes, I know, again, I'll say it again, they seem very, very simple, but they're very, very powerful in getting people to say more. And again, our attempt here is to get people to give us richer information. I'm just going to go through this one really quickly, and then I want to practice a little bit, but letting the informant lead in unstructured interviewing, you keep the conversation focused on a topic while giving the informant room to define the content. Get an informant onto a topic of interest or a group of informants, and then get out of the way. Let them provide the information that they think is important, and the probes are designed to do that. So let them lead. Don't be jumping in with questions all the time. Okay, the next couple slides are just to help you think through how to structure a question. And this is not exhaustive, and this actually comes from ethnographic interviewing, a guy named Spradley, whose work really helped transform the way I interviewed. These are more specific to ethnographic, but and ethnographic really is interested in terms and words and concepts, maybe more than we are. But local terms and local concepts, native language can be very, digging in and understanding them can be powerful, even if it's your own language, right? So, there are in-group languages within English that I don't know. I don't know the language of, there are a lot of terms in the language of my 26-year-old son that are not accessible to me. So when I talk about language, which a lot of these are, it can be even in a language that you speak, but in a group that you don't necessarily know very well, or don't really know their vocabulary or how they interact. So descriptive questions, we have grand tour, example, experience, and native language. And these are, we'll get into each one, structural questions and then contrast questions. And again, the grand tour are things like, talk to me about a typical day here. So typical. Tell me how things are, tell me how people generally deal with pests in this community. Just generally speaking, how do you cope with the hungry season here? Big grand tour, that's the whole idea. Big, specific. This is one, okay, so walk me through your day. Walk me through a typical day of you going to the market with your produce. Just talk to me about what happens. Guided, and this will come back to participatory tools. Show me around. So let me go to the market with you today and let me observe, let me see, let me walk around campus with you as you go to class and see what you're experiencing. And then task, and again, we use guided and task a lot in participatory. Draw me a map. Show me this part of the community, whatever. Another type of descriptive question is example. Give me an example of what you mean by that. So you mentioned challenges your community face in helping returning war veterans integrate into your community. Could you give me some examples of those challenges? You use the word challenges. What are some examples of that? Experience questions. Tell me about some experience of trying to help homeless men in this community. Right, so if I'm going into a community and I'm asking people how they deal with homelessness in the community, what are some things that people here are trying? There's general big. I'm not digging in real deep. I'm just trying to get a big lay of the land kind of thing. And it's really good to start with these grand tour questions, right? Because a lot of times we think we know things, and this is just sort of an opening into a world. And then native language. You mentioned how Niha, this word Niha is a word I learned in West Africa and in Mauritania, has changed here. Tell me more about how Niha works. So this is where you might hear a specific term, right? And you wanna get into what that word means. And again, this can even be words, be really cautious in your own language. There can be words that are being used in very specific ways. I remember going to Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, and these young men were talking about this disease called sun. And people in the community were like, yeah, we've heard that word, but we're not really sure how they're using it. It was really specific among younger men. And it turned out to be they had a very particular, it was a sexually transmitted illness, and they had a very particular understanding of it that older people in the community didn't have. Everybody knew that word as something that was some illness that afflicted people, but the young people had a real specific meaning attached to it. So you mentioned sun here. Tell me about what causes that. Was kind of the thing that we did. So those are your descriptive questions. And the grand tour, and then example, experience, and native language. And really, these descriptive questions are the basis of ethnographic interviewing. And I would argue of when you enter a place for the first time and want to learn and want to set yourself up as a learner, not just as someone who's here to solve problems, but as a true learner. These are great ways to do it in any environment. Structural questions are for verifying. So learning relationships between things. So if you've sat down with people and said, talk to me about how people deal with the problem of vermin in fields here, and they come up with, all these different concepts and ways. So you might come back in a structural question and say, all right, let's talk about these different approaches that you have and maybe start comparing them. So of these three approaches that you're using, talk to me about the differences and how you apply them. That's a structural question. Here I have some examples. What are some of the different kinds of loha? Again, that's a local term. We had this term in East Africa, mambolayo, that we kept hearing and kept hearing and kept hearing, and we needed to understand. It was an illness, and we needed to understand. So our structural question is, I'm interested in knowing different symptoms of mambolayo. Like what does it appear as? Again, these are to dig deeper into the terms and relationships. You said that women here are afraid to go out alone because of teasing. This was something that was said to me in English. Teasing means something very specific to me. What are some ways you have seen teasing take place here? What is that? So you're probing into what it means. Those are structural questions. And then contrast questions obviously are contrast. So what are the differences between the hardcore homeless and newbies? So people, a few years ago, people would say, oh, he's hardcore, and that's a newbie. Well, what are some differences between them? I mean, he's been on the street a long time. But it's not just that. A newbie is like usually a young woman, and they get taken advantage of, and the hardcore, those are people that have been around the block and they know how to take advantage of the system. So by asking differences, you don't just, I could look at this and say, well, yeah, hardcore, homeless, and newbie, I probably know the difference, but there were real deep nuances of difference. Newbies don't know how to work the system. Hardcore, they may not even be homeless right now, but they still know how to work the system, is what I would hear when I would ask these questions. Earlier, you said that the second generation of Hmong immigrants view violence differently than the first generation. Give me some examples of the differences between the two. Again, these look pretty simple, right? But if you start thinking more, more critically about how you ask questions, these can really help improve your learning. So I put them out there just so that they can help you think through even how you're asking questions and following up with questions. Let me stop there. Were there any, so we've gone through probes now, and we've gone through different types of questions. Does anybody want to pause and say anything about any of that or ask anything about that? I always get to this point and say, is it too simplistic? You really have to practice this.
I feel like what I'm sort of thinking about now is like, what's the difference between sort of just a general discussion and when you're just talking to someone and like actually interviewing them, and from your experience, like when you just like talk to someone about the situation over dinner where it's not such a formal interview setting, you get sort of different.
Good question. We are definitely, so there's a place even in sort of when we enter a community to do that totally unstructured thing. When we go and we're invited into a home, people are showing us hospitality, or we're just meeting people for the first time, that sort of general, who are you, background, there's a place for that. And I would say that a lot of what we end up asking later may flow from the basic things we learn as we just enter a situation. I'm talking about something where you are setting yourself up as a learner. Everybody knows it. You're setting yourself up as an interview. You're approaching someone and saying, there's some questions I want to ask you to understand things, a little bit more in depth. You want it. So here's a real big difference in an unstructured, and a totally unstructured sort of, I won't even call it an interview. There's a you actually, it's probably socially appropriate for there to be balance, right? If it's you just probing me with questions, like, can I ask you something about yourself? I mean, that's a little bit odd. So tell me about your mom. Tell me about your home country. Tell me about we want balance, right? It ebbs and flows. There's natural silences. People pick up the conversation. There's no real direction to it. Here, you're establishing yourself saying, I want to talk to you about this. And you're going to help me understand some things about this. There's some questions that I want to ask. If you want to ask me questions at the end, you can ask me anything you want, but you're really establishing yourself, and it's semi-structured in the sense that you have some themes that you want to explore. Not every theme. It's usually bounded by things that you really want to dig into. So and you're establishing yourself that way. You're saying, I want to sit down and talk to you. I have some things I really want to learn from you. I want to gain a deeper understanding of, and you're establishing yourself as an interviewer. My experience is, it's rare that people refuse to be interviewed. The only times I've really seen it is when I've entered communities where there's deep conflict, typically violence, and people are just afraid. And that is really challenging. Most other places, there's certainly things that are going to cause interviews to go awry. It took me a long time. We would used to do these group interviews with men and women in Mauritania, and I would just throw out questions about children. Well, what do your children do while you're in the fields? And my colleagues came to me and said, Rob, you can't ask questions about children in mixed groups. So you learn those things, but generally if you have a one-on-one or a small group and you've kind of vetted what you're doing, people are ready to respond. That's my experience. Does that help? Okay.
I have a question.
Hey, just so you know, all the mics are muted right now. Nobody can hear the question. Yeah.
We were all muted. Could you
Okay.
Sorry.
That I believe that sometimes people would not relate to you, so people would stay a little bit more shut to you. And how could you make that change? For example, if you're interviewing a man and they in another conference they have a macho society, or for example, what I noticed that maybe Mexican farmers open more with me because they relate to me because I'm Mexican, and then I see the same with when a white man interviews another white man. Right. So I don't know, how can we go and make them open to us?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one of the reasons why, especially, and I don't know how you're going to be doing this, your work in the field. Most of the work that I've done over the years using these approaches has been done in a team of people, and we purposely choose our team to represent different, men, women, younger, older, and we think about who's talking to whom. So we think about our team composition, and we think about who we want to interview, and we give serious consideration to who's speaking to whom. If you can't do that completely, to me, it's a longer process. So you may need multiple interviews, or you may need to create a little bit of a relationship with someone. And what I mean by that, so there's a couple ways to think about doing that. One is, think really clearly about sensitive questions and don't start with them. Give people an opportunity to feel comfortable that the questions you're asking are, number one, questions they can answer and questions they're not afraid to answer. Follow their lead. I don't know what your experience is, but I learned this I learned this in this field, but also in my role now in the city. One way to gain confidence of people is when you use probes and you're using their words. When people hear you using their words, that you value their words, and you're saying, you talked about A, B, C, D, and you use their words, that creates like this, it creates a kind of trust that, wow, this person is listening to me. But I think that, so being careful up front to introduce why you're there, what your learning objectives are, that there will be an opportunity to ask questions, asking questions that build confidence that people can answer the questions. Because sometimes people think, I don't have anything to say to this person. They're educated, they're not from here, they're really smart, I'm ignorant. People have said that. So building confidence that they know, and then giving them, then moving on to the more sensitive things later, and maybe not even dealing with sensitive things. There are barriers that we're not going to be able to overcome. And there are times when, and there have been very specific times where we have said in our team interactions, we need this person to interview this person because they're the only one that has that trust. And that's why I'm really committed to doing a lot of this. I didn't say that as part of the team. I don't know if that helps, but those are just some things that come to my mind.
There's another question that came in the chat. Do we see any drawbacks of asking a respondent to repeat their answers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if you do it a lot, the person can say, are you, but strategically, and the way I typically do it is just, because I am taking notes, right? And I even say that at the beginning, I'm going to be taking notes because I want to make sure I capture the important things that you're saying to me. Is that okay? And they always say yes, of course. I mean, people generally don't mind you taking notes. And then the way I'll frame the repeat question is, you were talking about this. I was wondering if you would just say that again, because you said some things and I want to make sure that I really understood what you were saying. So would you mind repeating that? And that, I use them judiciously, because if you're always saying, could you repeat that? Could you repeat that? It does give a sense that I'm not really listening to you. So yeah, hope that helps. Well, this is a long list of things. But these are some of the things that are tips for like how to do it, right? And they kind of, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Carla, you gave it to me at the beginning, I forgot it. Carla, this kind of gets at what you were saying, Carla. So do not begin the interview right away. Do some greetings, whatever's locally appropriate. Make sure you're expressing interest. It's not, it is a friendly conversation. It's not just strict answer, question answer. We're using these probes to help them expand, use their own language. Those are always really good things. I'm just going to leave this with you. And we don't, in a typical class, we would spend a lot of time practicing interviewing so that we could do it. And again, I'm happy to help people do that. If you want me to observe you interviewing, we can set that up.
Just one question. Can you explain cultural ignorance?
Yeah, that is being appropriately, saying being honest about saying I don't really understand how things work here, because people don't often. A lot. I think in any given group we would say, well, if you're here with me, you generally understand how things work here. Right, you're here, I'm just assuming you generally know how things work here. And so what you're doing is you're setting yourself up at the beginning to say, I actually don't know how everything works here, so I may ask you questions that seem kind of basic, but it's because I don't really know how things work here. We make a lot of assumptions about what people do know about us, and as an interviewer, you want to set yourself up to say, some of the questions I ask, like I've been in situations where I've asked people a question and someone would say to me, well, everybody knows that. I mean, why, almost like, why are you asking me that? And it's like, actually, I don't know if I know, so I'm just checking if I know. That's expressing cultural ignorance. And it needs to be genuine. It needs to be genuine, yeah.
I'm wondering, so we sent out an interview template to students to help guide them in gathering information about their organizations and more about the organizational capacities, what their mission is, who they serve, just to get more background information for their project. I know that some of the NGOs and universities students are working with are pretty capacity limited. How do we frame the interview in a way that is respectful of their time and not
like just sapping their time and resources to be like, talk to me because I want to learn. And I think it's really important to have the interview and the dialogue between the student and organization. But for instance, my organization, I think, has been a little reticent to let me interview them because they're very limited capacity.
Yeah, well, that's the hard choice. I mean, we do have to respect people's time, obviously. And what you may want to do is, look, I would just like 15 minutes of your time. And if I could do that with 3 people over the next 3 days, then you have to make hard choices. Like, what is it that you want to do with that time? And so if there are things that you can gain in other ways, like you mentioned mission.
Website.
Yeah, I mean, get as much as you can background before you go in, and then use that to guide something that strikes you that you may want to go in more in depth with. I mean, if I were going into a situation where there is some information available, I would probably use, and this is just me, right? I don't, but I would probably use my more in-depth interviewing to get people to do 2 things. And one is, talk to me about what's really working well for you here. And I lead with that because leading with an appreciative approach sets an energy. So if you come in problem posing, like, okay, so tell me about your heart, you know, what's really challenging for you in this context? No, come in with an open sort of grand tour question. Talk to me about what you think are some of the fundamental strengths of your work in this area. That's how I would lead, because then a lot, again, using probes, a lot can come off of that. And then you can follow it with a question, all right, so talk to me now about some of the things that are most concerning to you about your work here. But you have to be really clear on how you're going to use that 15 minutes. And you may want to spend a fair bit of time saying, all right, what do I know? And for now, for where I am right now, what do I need? What else do I need to know? And you're just going to have to make hard choices because you can't get everything.
I have a comment kind of going off of that. A lot of us have a very defined problem that we're trying to address and something that we're trying to fix within that organization and help them with. What are some ways that you recommend to kind of go about getting them to define what they anticipate our role in the project to be, to kind of, how did you guys word that? Like defining your
responsibility. Yeah, your expectations.
Yeah, your expectations, to try and gauge that without seeming like ignorant or without acting like you don't know what you're doing, I guess.
I just to follow up with that, I talked to my host organization and I felt like I could get no information out of him. Like I was like, you know, can you give me some more information? And he just was like, I don't know, maybe I'm a poor interviewer at this point, but it could also be because like you're on Skype, the connection's bad. Like there was a lot of things that contribute to that matter.
I think it's easier. It's clear. I mean, interviewing at distance is really hard. I've done it for some evaluations. It's really hard. I don't know if I'm going to give a helpful answer or not. Let me try. I think and it may come to some participatory tools, but that we can talk about. But I think in that case, what I would think about doing is sort of saying, you know, as I've been coming into this context, you know, and thought about coming here, these are some of the things that, you know, I understood were important for me to be doing. And if you're doing this as a group, you could just say, you know, what I'm really interested in hearing from you are, what are some things that you would add to that, or what are some things that, you know, where your understanding may be a little bit different. And I've done this in situations where I've gone in to do an evaluation of a program. So I'll go and sit down with a group and I'll say, all right, I was asked to come and take care, you know, and look over the following things. This is what I've understood, you know, I'm here to do. What I'd like you to do for the next couple minutes is just, you know, 2 by 2, is just to talk to each other about, you know, what I just said, what seems to resonate with you, or where you'd like to suggest something a little bit different. And then in a few minutes, like I'm just going to ask you to talk for a minute or two, and then I'd like to hear your responses if you would. And what that does is it gives everybody a chance to talk, but it also is grounded in what you're bringing. I mean, you could consider doing something like that. You could also, which should be more fun and more participatory, and again, you might be a little nervous about this. I wouldn't be. You could put some different terms about your role on some note cards and just say to people, these are the roles that I understood that I was coming in for, or these terms describe some of the things that I came to do. Each of you take them and just, I'd like you to just put them in piles. Which ones do you think are most important to your organization? Which ones are less important to you? And here's some blank ones. What do I need to add to what I'm doing while I'm here? So those are more participatory tools using sort of a pile sorting methodology. Don't be afraid to use those. It gives people something to do rather than just sit around and talk. And which ones you can say, make a pile of any of these that you just don't get what I'm talking about. What's a thought?
I have something that might help. And Rob can let me know if this sounds like a good strategy. Thinking about limited time and communicating with our organizations, I've tried to prioritize the activities and deliverables they've identified to figure out, okay, this is what I need to get done in the first part of my project, and just to try to clarify and work through that single deliverable first. So say it's my literature review, I want to know what kind of information they want, in what format. And then after I do that, I'll revisit with them, okay, they want training materials, what is the format they want for that? Just because I think I was like assailing them with too many questions at first, and maybe that was overwhelming to them.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really good. I mean, this is the challenge is, I mean, I'm talking about interviewing, where there is kind of an agreement. You're talking about relationship building with organizations, and so it is a bit of a dance, right? And the dance is going in, and I think you're really wise, going in and demonstrating that you really are here to provide a value added to them. And in that context, making it clear that there's something that you're willing to offer. So I'm not really accounting for that critical relationship building when I talk about interviewing, but it's there. I mean, it's there a little bit in kind of the response I gave you to the question of if there's no relationship, you've got to build some rapport. And the way to do that, I think, is to be respectful, to listen, to set yourself up as a learner. When we used to go in to communities to do 3 or 4 day learning events together, knowing that they had to be in their fields and doing other things, we would negotiate up front. What would you like to get out of this? And people would say, well, we really want to be able to tell our story to the local government official who, we've been asking to come to our community and give us some help, and they never come over. Well, what if we agree to go with you with what we learn here and discuss it? We would negotiate things like that. It was really a negotiation without calling it that, so that people would feel like their time wasn't being wasted. I don't have an easy answer, but those are just some things. All right, I see our time is really flying by here, and I've only just got to this checklist. I'm not going to I was going to try to do an interview, but I do want to spend a few minutes on the participatory tools just so you get an introduction to them. This just summarizes, and the way I use this is I use it to prepare my own interviews. How am I thinking about this interview? And this is not the guide, right? This is not a guide. The checklist is not a guide, but it is some things to think about. My guide, I was thinking about interviewing Lauren today, and I don't know, this is my guide, right? It's all of one page where I have, I wanted to talk to Lauren about challenges graduate students are facing, and I had 4 things that I wanted to really probe on: financial, time constraints, housing, and academic issues. And so then I use this to say, all right, what's my grand tour question that I want to start with? What are some probes that I want to make sure I get to? And I was using this to sort of think about follow-up questions that I might use. The guide was pretty basic. And again, it's a pretty basic topic, but because I just wanted to explore it. But this checklist is really designed to help you think through all of these different things we've talked about. I'm going to go ahead and go through these. All right, just really briefly in the last 15 minutes, and I kind of expected that we would spend less time on this than I wanted. So what are participatory learning approaches? Well, they are qualitative learning tools with 4 twists, if you will, 4 unique things. One is they're group-based. So participatory learning tools, they're almost always done with a group of people, a group of women, or a whole community, or a group of young people, or maybe a group of children, farmers in their fields, group. And what you really want, and the reason that can be useful is, rather than just being, I'm asking you questions and you're responding, what we're really trying to get at is get the group talking to each other, right, about a topic. It's interactive, and this is what I mean by the disappearing interviewer. Throw out a question and let people get into it so they're talking to each other and not talking to you, and you disappear. This doesn't always happen, but in the best of times, you'll begin to hear people having a community dialogue, and you're an observer of that dialogue. When I was with, the IAD class, I had them do a little participatory activity on relationships. And it was interesting. A lot of information came out, but there was also people talking to each other about what they meant, if you remember that.
Yeah,
and so it's interactive in that way. It's visual, really important. Participatory learning tools are not just questions and I'm writing answers. I'm actually encouraging you to do something, to draw something, either on the ground or on a piece of paper, to rank something, to sort something. There's a visual element to it. And that's important because it's not just words hanging in the air, but there's something that we all are owning as a diagram that we can all relate to and participate in. And then there's a kinesthetic element. And what I mean by that is we're moving our bodies. We're not just talking back and forth, but we're actually, as I said, drawing or ranking, using piles of stones to show the ranking, sorting things into different piles, using symbols, drawing maps, etc. So real quickly, these are the types of tools, and I'm going to go through them, just here really quickly. There are spatial tools. So spatial tools, and again, and this isn't necessarily true with an organization, but if you're going to a community, spatial tools are almost like where you want to start. Like, draw me a map of of this area, or here's how I came into the community. And there's a whole, I can send you a whole booklet on how to start these tools, like how to make, how to get them going. I'm not getting into that, but maps are a great way to get people to introduce their community to you. And I've done many dozens of these just on the ground using sticks and having people draw it, or like we did one that I'm going to show you on the floor of a church in Kenya, where people use chalk and dust and stuff. Then walkabouts basically are taking the map and saying, okay, let's show me this. Let's walk over to that irrigated area, or let's walk down to that water pipe, or let's walk over to where your property ends and where there's been conflict with the neighbors. Let's see that. So that's spatial, right? A big important one is, and these are more difficult depending on the conflictual nature of the area, but social and relational. I call them Venns, but they're, because to get at the idea that relationships are oftentimes overlapping, right? But social mapping, and I'll show you an example of this. Who are the important relationships in this place? How do they interact? Do they live here? Are they at distance? What's the type of relationship? What's the power dynamic? Who matters? Who speaks to whom? I'll give you an example of that. Temporal. These are very important obviously in ag work and in areas where you have definitive seasons that are very, very marked. Seasonal calendars, timelines. And I'm thinking more and more, I forgot, recently I was talking to someone about a project they want to do, but having people discuss histories of their community. And we've done this in so many different ways, but we would be like, so we're here today. This is 10 years ago. This is 20 years ago. Talk to me about what was happening, and just put a stone down in a relative place where something important happened. So people will put down like droughts, or when the pest invasion was, the locust infestation, or when the trees died, or when the cattle died, or when, the whatever. I mean, there are just so many things that come out, but those are longer time horizons. So you can do them seasonal, or you can do them longer. Preferential, these are rankings, and they can be 2 by 2, or they can just be a whole list of things where people talk about practices, or people talk about healthcare choices, or they talk about where they go to treat different illnesses, and then you get them to rank them in different ways, like which one do you prefer? Talk to me about why, the reasons why you're putting that one first. That is a why question. But, when after the ranking is done, and while the ranking is being done, people are telling you, I put this one number 1 because they're really friendly. Like, they always help me. Even if they don't help me, they help me. Something like that. Comparative is where you get a little bit more complex in comparisons, where you have sort of multivariables that you're comparing a concept of. And I'll show you one quick example of that. Any sort of classification or sorting into different piles. I've already given an example of that. And then really powerful one is cause and effect problem trees, where you talk about the roots of a problem and the consequences of that problem. I just did this recently with a group of high school students here in the city who were volunteering at a homeless program. I put homelessness as the trunk of the tree, and I had them over about a 10-minute period discuss the causes and the consequences that they had learned from homeless individuals with whom they were working. It was a far more nuanced understanding of homelessness than the typical Davisite would ever be able to give. It was fascinating. So these are very powerful, and people will get into quite nuanced understanding. So here's an example, and I know these are small, but this is the map we drew on the floor of the church. You can't see a lot of it, but to the left were unirrigated fields, and to the right were a really intricate set of springs and irrigation systems. And this was a fascinating community because the folks that had access to the irrigation were longer-term residents. The ones on the right were newcomers. There was a lot of inequity. There was budding conflict along that sort of I think it was an east-west road that cuts the 2 in half. There was also at the bottom a water main that ran from the hillside down to a major commercial farm that they didn't have access to. So this was a map that they drew over the course of about 3 or 4 days as people came in and would add things to it. And it led to really rich discussions. And we used this map then to basically circumnavigate this whole community. The length of this is about, I would say, 5 to 6 kilometers. And we walked pretty much the whole community over the course of about 2 days with different groups of people asking them questions. But it all started with this map. So that's what I mean by a spatial map. And this was drawn, again, by people using chalk and dust and symbols of churches and different things like that. And we just transferred it to a piece of paper. This was a Venn diagram I did in a community in Mauritania. People, of course, didn't write words. They used different symbols that they found. But what was interesting about this, and you can't really see it, but at the bottom, after they had laid out, and these were tribal groups, these were family relationships, these were, the one in the middle is the chief and the village council, and a women's group and a benevolence group. They had all these different words, but then at the bottom, they started telling us what types of relationships they were. So this is a political relationship. We just vote for them, and then they give us what we want. We don't really have much of a relationship anymore. It's more of a historical relationship where we knew them in the past, and we keep a little contact. This is a very important economic relationship. We give them things, they give us things. So after they had laid everything out in terms of, and this was a really remote community. And some of these relationships, if you see at the top, this is written in French, but it's family members in the Emirates. So this was in West Africa, and a key relationship to them was these family members who sent them money. It was a key economic relationship. So this was just, tell us who the relationships are, important people in this community. They came up with them, and then they on their own started saying, yeah, but that's really just a historical relationship. We don't really see them very much anymore. Yeah, you're right. We had that falling out with them. This one is really important because we exchange with them like every day, So that's a relational. And these are really powerful, but they can be hard where there's conflict. This is actually a series of seasonal calendars put together into one. Over on the left, we were able to establish, first of all, that this community divided their year into 4 distinct seasons. And then we did a series of activities where we talked about when labor was scarce, when out-migration was most important, when women's work was the hardest, when men's work was the hardest, a whole series of questions that we then after we traced it on the ground in a series of activities transferred to here. But it was all based first on getting how people broke the year down into different seasons. This was not our conception. Here's an example of a preferential ranking. We got women in this Maasai community in Kenya to list all a bunch of illnesses that affected their children. Right? Just tell us illnesses, and we translated them into English roughly. And then we said, all right, and we gave them piles of stones. Put more stones in the ones that you're most afraid of and fewer stones in the ones that you're less afraid of. And so measles was the one they were most afraid of. And measles was a big problem there. Then we said, all right, which ones occur most frequently? Well, not surprisingly there, malaria, was fever was the most frequent. And then which are the most costly to treat? And so on these different parameters, we had them rank them, but it was all with stones, right? They made a symbol of each of these on the ground, and then we gave them stones, and they would plop down a number of stones and debate it. No, I think it's more afraid. And the idea wasn't just the idea was to see which ones were the most, not necessarily get all of them ranked in some really detailed order, but what were the most important to them, the most feared. And we had some reasons for doing this. We were trying to figure out where malaria sat in terms of people's interests, because we were interested in doing some work in malaria there. And then we actually learned that it's in the top 3 on everything, right? Not surprisingly. And that helped us have a conversation about malaria, ultimately. Here's a healthcare matrix I did in Guinea-Bissau, I think, which again is different diseases and where they're treated, and which ones are most important. I won't get into that. Here was a cause and effect tree, and I think I told the class when I taught it, and this was a really life-changing experience for me. I had been in Mauritania for a while, but what we did was we had spent about a week with this community on and off, and so we knew that they had a hungry season, a really serious hungry season. And so we just at the end of our stay there, we just came in with a rock, and we put it on the ground, and we said, this is Levleka, this is your hungry season. This is when you don't have enough food. All right, what causes that? And they started off by saying, really right out of the gate, we don't have enough money, and then we don't produce enough food. So that's where those 2 things came from. And then from there, we went and said, all right, well, let's talk about, what are the causes of not being able to have enough food production or revenue? But the most important thing in this was really what came out as results, because this is where we saw the real social stresses. So they talked really frankly about going into debt, having to sell cattle, which was a means of store of value, and then these up on the top were begging, lying, dependency on other communities, imprisonment. And this was mostly the women that talked about how they were losing their ability to cope because so many of the young men were getting into trouble. And it was, it was a life-changing experience for me to hear them talk so frankly about these things and to realize that this represented, a significant part of their life. And we used this to then go back later and we actually focused on gardening here for a number of reasons, but we went back and were able to do some rehabilitation of a well so that they could do some kitchen gardening, which was an income source, but also a source of vitamin A for them. I think that's where I need to stop too. I know it was really fast. I'm happy to follow up with anybody on any of these. This is my contact information. I can send out, and I don't know if you have it from your course here at UC Davis, but a manual on PLA tools and how to sort of do them. I can get it to you if you want. It's a real basic PDF manual that we wrote back. Again, a lot of this we developed years ago, and I've evolved my practice in it, but I still go back to some of the similar tools because they really work well. The key in all of those participatory tools, I'll just say it again, is you're probing, right? You're asking questions. So we didn't get into, the Venn diagram is a really important one. I mean, there was a lot of probing that happened here. So you have these lohas. Give us some examples of lohas, right? And so they gave us a whole bunch of examples, which was a way of sharing, informal sharing, like gift giving. But this was developed over about a 2-hour period with a group, and there was a lot of probing there. So it was an interview, but the difference was we had a group of us taking notes, and we had a variety of people speaking into it. but was still based on the same principles of a big open question and then probes to go deeper.
Can we just swap mics for a second if you mute yourself? Great. Thanks, Rob. That was super helpful. We might have to, sorry, we're playing that game again. Great, thank you. Yeah, so I guess my quick immediate thoughts, we don't really have time for questions, except that if people have questions, you can feel free to email Rob or email Trellis Fund, and we'll try to keep the conversation going. My immediate thoughts are that I think most students should try to interview their organization at least once before you travel, even if it's 30 minutes to get more background on the project and just to really situate yourself in what you're going to be doing. And you can use some of these interview tools to help guide that conversation. And then I think it's a great idea to interview them again once you're there. Having structured FaceTime is obviously better than Skype or phone. And then I think some of the PLA tools Rob described, especially the walkabout, doing a mapping exercise, looking at the Venn diagram, and social mapping. I think those are all things you can do if you're interested and if your organization's interested when you're in country. I think it's hard for you to facilitate those remotely and have them be truly participatory, with the exception of problem trees. We are working on this in our IAD project management class, and I think it would be possible for people to put together a problem tree and then send it to your organization and say, am I conceiving of this problem correctly? Like, is my logic, am I understanding what's going on here? And then you might realize your understanding is off, and you can work together to get both you and the organization on the same page of like what's really going on in this trellis project and in the community. I'm going to share my screen for one quick second here, just so I can show you. So on PyStar, I've posted Rob's slides are there. So that's under Trellis Seminar Resources for Students. So this will bring you into the Google Drive folder where I've been posting most things. And so everything from Rob's session is here, and we'll post the recording from today there as well. But some new resources I wanted to briefly bring to everyone's attention is here under additional resources. I've put a bunch of any organization that has been previously funded, and I think it's 10 out of the 15. We're calling them alumni organizations, so they may have been funded back in 2012 or even last year in 2017. I've put resources from previous years in here, so it might be like the travel report from the student who went that year or the final report from the organization. So feel free to go through those. Anyone can see anyone else's, so nothing is like super private, I guess, but hopefully it'll be helpful for you to see things that have happened in past years. And it might not be the exact same project that you're working on now, but it could help inform you what a previous student's experience was like. So these are available for you in the Google Drive. And we will send a follow-up email with next steps. Again, here's the interview template that's on PyStar as well, if you want to use this as a starting place for getting more information about your organizations and their mission. But I know we're over time right now, so thank you everyone for attending, and we will send a follow-up email. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and yeah, be in touch with Rob as well. He's super helpful. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Well, you guys are here. I'm happy to meet with you anytime on campus. I just spoke over at the International Center, so you know,